Hello, and welcome to the JAGGAER 21.2 release feature demonstration for Contracts Plus. There have been many improvements to the JAGGAER Contracts Plus solution this release, including automatic metadata updates when placeholders change, the ability to restrict e-signature based on jurisdiction, a new way to configure visibility of some fields by contract type, improved unit of measure and commodity code integration, enhanced usability of review rounds, along with additional enhancements. The first feature we will discuss is the feature that allows for the metadata to update automatically when placeholders change. Currently, if a placeholder is edited in the Word add-in, a user must go into Contracts Plus and manually make that change to the metadata to match it. This is not only inefficient, but it also leaves room for unintended errors that can have big consequences. Now, placeholder changes made to the main document from the Word add-in will update the metadata in Contracts Plus automatically when it's checked in. This will save time and maintain consistency between what's in the Contracts Plus solution and what is in the main document text. Now, there is an asterisk here because you should be aware that this feature applies to certain placeholders only, not for every placeholder at this time. Please see the release notes for more information about which specific placeholders this feature applies to. Now, this feature can be used in two ways. The first being with changes that you, the customer, make to the contract from the Word add-in. So if a contract manager, for example, has made some changes to placeholder values while editing in Word, then when they go to check the contract in to Contracts Plus, they'll see the option to accept any changes that have been made to contract fields, thereby confirming the changes to the placeholder values. They'll see those values update immediately on the contract back in Contracts Plus. The second way this may be used is when accepting changes that the second party or supplier has made to the placeholder values during negotiation. For example, maybe you have an external review round going on, and you run a compare in the Communication Center to compare your version of the main document to the one the second party sent back. There, you'll be able to view placeholder differences and either accept those changes or not. If you accept them, the update will be made automatically. You don't have to manually edit those fields on the contract. We're going to take a look at this in just a moment, but before we do, I want to highlight that this feature only applies to placeholders in the main document, not other attachments you may have associated with the contract record. Before we dive into Contracts Plus and explore this new feature, let's just take a quick look at what we can expect to see with a couple of screenshots. This screenshot would be an example of a contract manager who is editing the contract in Word. They can make changes to the contract metadata that's contained in the placeholders directly in Word. Before checking in the contract, they'll see contract fields to be modified with a checkbox next to each contract placeholder field that was changed. They can confirm the change by checking the box, and it will update the contract header within Contracts Plus once it's checked in. And this is what a contract manager might see if they are reviewing changes that the supplier made to the Word document in the Communication Center. Any changes the supplier made to the contract metadata placeholders are identified, and the contract manager has the option to accept or decline the changes to eligible placeholders. If they're accepted, they will be automatically applied without the contract manager having to navigate back to the contract record and manually make those changes. Now let's go into Contracts Plus and have a look at how this feature works. I'm currently acting as a contract manager at my organization, Hunter Industries, and I'm viewing a contract main document in Microsoft Word using the add-in. First, let's show placeholders just so we can easily identify them. We can do that by going to Design Mode under Developer, and it's going to highlight all of our placeholders for us. So you can see that they are scattered throughout the document here, and I'm not going to change too many of them. But suppose I'm editing this contract here, and I want to make a few changes. Maybe I want to slightly adjust our start date and end date. I'll change our renewal term, and I'll add a summary. Now for this example today, let's just say that all of my changes are all done and I'm ready to check in the contract. When I click Check In, I can see here a list of the contract fields I modified that are supported by this feature. So I changed the summary, start and end date, and renewal term. It tells me the old value and the new value, or proposed value, for each of these placeholder fields. And to accept the change, I can just click the checkbox, And if I don't want to accept the change, I can simply not check the box and that change will not be made. It won't be made in the contract header, nor will it be made here in the document when it's checked in. So in this demonstration, I'm going to accept the changes for all the placeholder fields except for end date. So we'll see that our end date will remain this old value of June 29th. So once again, I'm going to accept the other 3 changes, click OK to check in the contract, and then we'll see the implications of that back in Contracts Plus once this check-in is complete. Okay, now our contract was successfully checked in. Let's go back to the contract in Contracts Plus. Okay, so now I'm back on the contract header. I did check the contract back out just so you can see things a little more easily, but we can see that immediately those changes have been made. The summary is listed here. This is an agreement for IT services. The start date changed, but the end date did not, because remember, we did not confirm that change when we checked in our document. And the renewal term was changed to 3 years. So once we checked in our contract main document, and we can see here it's version 2, those changes were made automatically on the header. And the one that we did not want changed, the end date, remains the same in both Contracts Plus and if we were to download this version of the main document, because we said we did not want to change the end date. Now suppose some time has passed and we're in external review with our second party, National Transit. The contact at National Transit, Rebecca, has emailed me back her changes, and I can view her email and the attachment right from here in the Communication Center. I want to compare her version to mine. So I can go to the Actions dropdown in the Communication Center in her email here and select Compare With. I'll select which email attachment I want. Now in this case, she only attached the one document, the main document here, so there's no other choice. And let's compare. So the Compare view opens in a new tab of my browser, and we can see the changes that have been made between the 2 versions of the document. Now, if we click Open in Word to take a closer look, if there are any placeholder differences, we're going to see this overlay appear. Now, be sure to read the information in this blue banner at the top. It says that if there are any changes to placeholder values, you'll see them below, and they're organized by placeholder category. Any placeholder that's checked will be automatically updated on the contract record, so both in the Word document and in Contracts Plus, when you click the Continue to Word button. But you might be wondering why I can't take any action here. I don't see any checkboxes to the left of these placeholders in the Update column. The reason for that is explained in this blue banner. There's a reminder that we have to check out the contract. So when we entered external review, the contract is checked in. So we have to remember to check out the contract again to be able to make those changes. So right now, you'll see that I'm not able to accept and update these placeholder values. So let's back up for just a moment. I'm going to close out of this, go back to my contract. Under Contract Actions, I'll remember to check it out. And then let's go do that again. We'll compare. We'll see our Compare view open in Word. And now I see that list of modified placeholders, but I see the checkbox to update them. So I can quickly at a glance review which placeholder values were changed and decide right from here whether or not I want to accept that change. Remember that with this release, there's a limited selection of placeholders that this feature applies to. So you may or may not see some placeholders that have been changed, which you don't have the ability to automatically update. But for the ones for which we can update, to accept the changes, you can just click the checkbox next to the placeholder. In this case, I'm just going to accept all of these changes. And then when we click Continue to Word, it will download the main document in Word for me where I could see those changes have been made. And back on the contract, once refreshed, we'll also see those changes were made here. So we have our new start and end date, the changed renewal term, and even some contract custom fields have been updated based on the revisions from the supplier. So for the eligible placeholders, the metadata was updated automatically when we clicked the Continue to Word button. And for a full list of the supported placeholders, please be sure to see the release notes. That concludes our demonstration on this feature. Next, we will discuss the Restrict e-signature based on jurisdiction feature. Currently, if enabled in your organization, you can use e-signature on contracts regardless of the contract's jurisdiction. There are no restrictions. In 21.2, administrators can decide if and which jurisdictions should prohibit the use of electronic signature, maybe due to national or regional compliance policies or regulations. If this setting is enabled and contract managers try to use e-signature with a jurisdiction for which it is prevented, a validation will occur that will prevent them from submitting the contract to workflow. Let's go right into Contracts Plus and take a look at how this feature works. I'm currently viewing the e-signature administration page under General Contract Settings, and I'm acting as an administrator here in our organization at Hunter Industries. If I scroll down and we edit these e-signature settings, I have a new setting called Restrict e-signature based on jurisdiction. Now it's currently set to no, and this will be the default when 21.2 is deployed so that it won't affect the current behavior of your solution. But once you set it to yes, if you do want to restrict e-signature based on jurisdiction, you'll be prompted to choose which jurisdictions you want to prohibit e-signature in. Now, of course, for this to work, you must have jurisdictions enabled in your instance, and you can only select from the list of specific jurisdictions that you have enabled in your organization. From this overlay, you can select one or multiple jurisdictions. In my case, I'm going to choose a few where we want to prohibit the use of e-signature. So I'll select them and click Done. And now they've been listed here. We just need to make sure to save our changes. And there we go. Now let's look at the implications of this on a contract. So I'm viewing this contract that's in draft. There's currently no jurisdiction selected yet. You can see that I can choose yes or no for use e-signature on this contract. Let's say I choose Brazil for the jurisdiction. That's one of the ones where we just prohibited e-signature from being used. You might notice that I can still select yes or no. It's not that it prevents me from selecting yes, and I can still proceed with creating the contract. Now, however, if I save my progress, because I selected a jurisdiction where e-signature is not allowed, but then I chose yes for e-signature on the contract, I do have a message here that's telling me I can't use e-signature with this jurisdiction. So it's a reminder that I need to come back and address this. Again, I can continue to work through my contract. It's not going to prevent me from clicking next and going to the following screens, but where this will prevent you from proceeding is on the Submit for Approval page. This is the point where it's going to tell me that e-signature is not allowed for that jurisdiction. That section of the header is then considered incomplete, and I cannot submit the contract for approval. I have to take action to resolve this issue. So again, just to clarify, you'll see a warning on the header. You'll still see an e-signature screen if you say yes here, but you will not be able to submit the contract for approval until you take care of that issue. From here, I'd either need to change the jurisdiction or change e-signature to be no. That concludes the demonstration for this feature. Next, we will learn how you can configure visibility of some fields by contract type in 21.2. Currently, field management is the only way to determine the visibility of some fields in the solution. In this release, the visibility of some fields can be determined by contract type. For example, if you are creating an NDA, there are probably some fields that you don't really need to complete or even see on the contract header, such as review date information, jurisdiction, etc. So now you have the option to hide them. Be aware that with this capability, field management is still a greater source of power. If a field is hidden in field management, you won't be able to make it visible on a specific contract. In fact, you won't even see it on the contract type configuration page. Let's have a look at this new feature in Contracts Plus. I'll begin by acting as an administrator here in our organization, and I'm viewing my contract types in Contract Administration. Let's select a contract type. For this demonstration, we'll choose Non-Disclosure Agreements. This is where we can establish some settings for our non-disclosure agreement contract types, and in 21.2, we'll see a new tab called Configuration. This is where you can indicate the visibility of some standard fields on this contract type. Editing them is pretty simple. It's the same way that you would edit permissions or user roles. First, you would click Edit Section and then choose to hide or show the field. For example, let's edit the dates and renewal fields. So we can click Edit Section, and let's say for the NDAs in our organization, we don't need any of these fields, review date, review term, or reviews remaining. So we can set that to always be off and save our changes. So now immediately, contracts that are the NDA contract type will not have these fields on them, whether they are new contracts or existing contracts. Let's look at another example. In my instance, I can hide jurisdiction, but I do want to point out that depending on your configuration, you may or may not be able to hide that field, or you may not even see the field listed here. For example, if you are not using jurisdictions in your organization, or if that's a field that's been hidden in field management, you won't even see it listed here to be able to hide it. And if you do see it listed here, there are some other factors that might come into play when setting the visibility. For example, if jurisdiction is required on the contract type, then you're not going to be able to hide it. If there are clauses configured with alternative language that use jurisdiction, you will be able to hide it, but you will see a warning message. So for more information about these specific nuances, please see the release notes. I'm going to hide jurisdiction in our organization for NDAs. And after we save that, if we go to the About tab here for our NDAs, you'll see that we can't make jurisdiction required until we unhide that field. So these are all related. Just to see another example, for transportation agreements, jurisdiction is required. So if I were to go to the Configuration tab and try to hide jurisdiction, it's going to give me a message here that says it cannot be hidden because it's configured as required, and we'll see that that change was not implemented, so it's still visible. Let's go back to our non-disclosure agreements and the Configuration tab, and let's hide one more field. Maybe in additional details, we don't ever use this details field, so we'll save our changes and hide that one as well. Now, these visibility settings inherit down the hierarchy of contract types just like the other settings do. So if we look at one of these child contract types underneath our NDAs and go to their respective configuration tabs, we're going to see that those are inherited. And of course, you can make additional changes to each specific child if you want to override the parent setting. You can do that as well. Now, be aware, if you hide a field, that means that field is not going to appear on any new or existing contracts, contract templates, summary pages, the summary overlay, or in the supplier's view in the portals. It'll be immediately hidden when we save our changes. Now, you might be wondering what happens if I have existing contracts and contract templates that had a value in that field before we hid the field. Don't worry, that value is still in the database and it will remain there, meaning that if an administrator ever makes this field visible again, it will be populated with that original value. And if you export your contracts, the value of that field will be included in the export. Same goes for amendments and renewals. If you create an amendment or a renewal on one of these contracts, then the field will be hidden on that amendment or renewal. But if there was a value that existed in the database, it's going to be there with the amendment and renewal as well. So now that we've saved our changes, let's look at this from a contract manager point of view, and let's create a contract that is a non-disclosure agreement, and we can see the implications of this. I've just created a contract that is the non-disclosure agreement type, and I do not see a jurisdiction field. I do not see any of those review date fields, and if I expand additional details, we don't see that details field either, only the searchable keywords. If we were to download the main document in Microsoft Word using the add-in, we wouldn't see any placeholders associated with those fields that we've hidden either. So again, once you hide the field on the contract type, the field is hidden immediately on both new and existing contracts. But if there was a value in that field previously, that value will still be stored in the database. You just won't see the field in the UI of the contract. That concludes our demonstration for this feature. Now we will discuss the improved integration for UOMs and commodity codes. Currently, it is not possible to restrict unit of measure or commodity code entry to be restricted to pre-approved codes only. This free-form entry can result in errors when contracts are exported to the ERP. This release, we are focused on improving the integration between Contracts Plus and your ERP, for example, SAP. We will now provide the ability to prevent free-form data entry of your UOMs or commodity codes when creating or editing contract non-catalog items. There are some new settings in general contract settings that will allow your organization to prevent free-form entry of the units of measure, commodity codes, or both. If the setting is enabled for either UOMs or commodity codes, then the user, when creating or editing a non-catalog item on the contract, will be required to select a valid value from a list of supported options. This will ensure that the user is choosing a value that will be valid within the ERP. One important note is that if you are not using commodity codes in your organization, be sure to leave this setting disabled, because if you don't have any commodity codes configured, you'll want to make sure your users can enter them manually with the free-form text. Otherwise, they won't have any options to choose from. Let's take a look at how this feature works. Let's begin this demonstration wearing our administrator hat. I'm currently in General Contract Settings on the General tab. When I scroll down to the bottom, I see this new section we have called Non-Catalog Items. Let's discuss each of these settings within this section. Enforce Contracted Quantity Limit. Now, if you've already watched the eProcurement 21.2 release video, you know a little bit about this feature. If you haven't and you'd like to learn more, please watch that for more information. But basically, there's a new functionality that allows your organization to enforce quantity limits on non-catalog items. This setting here determines the default. So if this is set to yes, then the enforce quantity flag will automatically be checked when a user creates a non-catalog item in the future. If this is set to no, then that flag will not be checked by default, though it can still be enabled at the item level. Next are those two settings I mentioned in the presentation. Prevent free-form entry of commodity code values and prevent free-form entry of UOM values. They are off by default when 21.2 rolls out, so if you're happy with the current behavior, you don't need to touch these. And as I mentioned before, if you do not use commodity codes in your organization, then be sure to leave this setting as no so that your users can enter those manually if need be. For our demonstration, I'm going to change both of these to be yes, so we can see the implications of that in a moment. Then we have one other new setting here called Contracts UOM Outbound to ERP Integration Value. This is a new setting for when contracts are exported, similar to another setting that we have for requisitions and POs that you might be familiar with. This will allow your contract exports unit of measure to have a different value than what you normally include in your other document exports, such as those requisitions or POs. So the options that you see here are the same types of UOM choices that you have for your recs and POs. Do you want to send the system value, the supplier value, or the mapped value? Supplier is the default right now because that's the current behavior. But maybe since this is going to our own ERP and not to a supplier, we want to use the system or mapped value. For more information about these specific mappings, please be sure to see the release notes. Now let's save our changes. So now I'm acting as a contract manager. I have this eProcurement contract up, and I'm viewing the Contract Non-Catalog Items area of the Goods and Services screen. Let's say I need to add a non-catalog item to my contract. So we'll add a new contract non-catalog item. We'll enter the basic information like the description of our item first. And now let's look at the impact of some of these settings. First, next to our contracted quantity, maybe that's 1,000, we see this checkbox for enforce contracted quantity, and it's checked by default because that's the default that we saw in the general contract settings. We can uncheck this at the item level if we want, it's just a default, but I'll leave it as enforced. And again, for more information on this feature, please watch the eProcurement 21.2 release demonstration. Now for unit of measure, remember that we turned on the setting to prevent free-form entry. So now I see 2 fields instead of just 1, and I can no longer enter just any old value here for our UOM. I have to select one from the dropdown. These are the valid, already configured and approved codes that we have in our organization so that we aren't able to enter an invalid code and potentially cause a big problem with our ERP. So we'll select from the dropdown and then we select the quantity, of course, here. So that's 2 separate fields because we turned that setting on. We also prevented free-form entry for commodity codes. So we'll see here that for commodity codes, we can override it by clicking the checkbox, and then we can use the type ahead or the magnifying glass to select a commodity code from our list of pre-approved codes. So that way, it's going to guarantee that the code I'm selecting is a valid code and it won't cause any errors within my ERP. Now, just remember, if you are not using commodity codes, you don't have those pre-configured ones in your organization, then you're going to want to leave that setting as off in general contract settings so that your end users can continue to enter free-form text if necessary. Let's just save our changes, and we'll see that small widget was added to our contract. That concludes the demonstration for this feature. Now let's talk about the enhanced usability of review rounds. Currently, the process of managing review rounds can be a little bit confusing to contract managers. In 21.2, we made some enhancements to improve the usability of review rounds, just to make the process a little bit more streamlined and intuitive for our users. The functionality of review rounds hasn't changed, we've just improved the look and feel for efficiency. Let's go into Contracts Plus and have a look at some of the changes that have been made. I'm viewing this contract for services, and it's just about ready to be sent for internal review. So we'll go to the review round screen. And the first thing you might notice is that the buttons look a little bit different. We now have separate buttons for Create Manual Internal Round and Start Automated Internal Round, instead of them being under the same dropdown. Remember that the automated internal review round is only for organizations that have that internal review workflow configured. So this may or may not apply to you, but if you do have that configured, you'll also see that the automated internal review steps is collapsed when you navigate to this page, just to avoid any confusion. So you can expand it and see information if you need to, but it's collapsed when you navigate here to simplify your experience. First thing we're going to do is run an automated internal round. Before we click this button though, let's just take a look and see who our reviewers are. So this is a list of the users who have been named reviewers on this step in the automated internal review workflow. Nothing new there. When we start the round, start automated internal round, I can enter a message to these reviewers just like always. But there's a new little message here that reminds us that the contract will be checked in once we start the round so that the reviewers can access it and do their work. So that's just a helpful tip for us to remember. Let's begin the automated internal round. And that takes us right back to the review round screen where we can see the current round. In previous releases, starting the round took us to a landing page and then we had to navigate back here. So it's just fewer clicks and a bit simpler of a process. Now remember that our enhancements here are just usability enhancements. It's mostly just a cleaner experience and process. So I'm going to just kind of move along here. We'll say that the reviewer is done with their review. What I've done is, as one of those reviewers, I've marked the review round complete. So now our contract is back in draft and we see this review round listed here. I want to point out a couple of minor changes that have been made to the manual internal round. If we start that by clicking this button, the first thing you'll notice is that the Add Reviewers overlay appears immediately. There's no need for an extra click to add reviewers. Let's add a couple of reviewers here once we save our changes. The Add Reviewer button appears below the list of names. We have our Begin Round button here, and all the way over to the right is where our Delete Round button is so that you don't accidentally click it when you're trying to begin the round. So again, no new functionality here, just looks a little bit different to make things more clear and efficient. Finally, let's take a look at some of the changes that have been made to the external round process. I'll click that button to get started. Just like with our manual internal round, the Add Reviewer overlay appears automatically, so it'll save you a click. This overlay is the same as in previous releases, but we also have a new Use Primary Second Party Contact checkbox that is selected by default. So this is the person that's named as the contact in the Contract Party section of the header, and their contact information will be listed here. So if that's the contact person that we want to use, that's going to save us a lot of time. We can just click Save and it's going to proceed. If this is not the person we want to send this to, we can just uncheck the box and enter a different reviewer. And I should mention too that if your contract does not have a second party contact named on the header, then of course this won't be an option and these fields would just be blank. Let's go ahead and use our primary second party contact and save. And after adding her as the reviewer, we could continue to add additional reviewers. We could begin the round or delete the round using the respective buttons. And beginning the round pulls up that same overlay that we've had in previous releases, where you can send the email and begin the external review. So once again, I know I've mentioned it a few times during this demonstration, but the functionality of review rounds is not changing at all. You'll just notice that buttons and messaging are a little clearer and the process will be easier to manage. That concludes our demonstration on this feature. Let's wrap up by discussing some additional enhancements that have been made in the 21.2 release. One additional enhancement is we extended our risk analysis capabilities to include non-disclosure agreements. You can now create a risk configuration type for NDAs in your organization if you are using that feature. We also enhanced ADW rules for contract custom fields that are the monetary type. Currently, the comparison values could only be equal to or not equal to. But in this release, we've expanded the options to include several additional values shown here. You can see that it includes options like between, less than, greater than or equal to, and more. To learn more about the Contracts Plus release features, as well as for all of the Jagger One solutions, please visit the Product Release Library. There you can view additional training videos and access the release notes. Now that you've learned about the new features available with the JAGGER 21.2 release for Contracts Plus, start testing them for your organization. We hope this new functionality will empower procurement, and we welcome you to contact us with your questions and feedback. Thank you very much for watching.